All right, we're going to start today by trying to bring together some of the sort of big picture ideas that we've been dealing with this semester, together with some of the work we've been doing on phonological distributions and filters and markedness constraints. And so we've been talking about phonology as a generative function that is an active base of implicit knowledge that can be productively applied to a potentially infinite variety of new inputs. And we've been framing that as the general idea that even if you're an adult speaker of native speaker of some language that already firmly knows their lexicon, you can still apply your phonological knowledge to a whole bunch of new items that might enter it at some point. And so we better characterize phonology as a system of knowledge that can be applied to novel inputs, even if you already have acquired your lexicon or something like that. Now, there's a different way of thinking about the necessity of phonology as a generative function that's going to have very similar logic, except it starts from infant language acquisition rather than adults dealing with novel forms. And from the point of view of an infant, everything is a novel form, right? At least until they start acquiring a lexicon, which happens surprisingly early. But this is the way we were thinking about markedness constraints. So we have a universal rich base that generates any collection of features as a possible word in any language. And so, this could involve things that are sort of uncontroversially word-like in many different languages, or things that are, maybe less word-like in some languages. And, these two forms are standing in for an infinite variety of more marked and less marked forms. Actually, let me give a slightly different one here. So here's a bunch of input forms, and in real life we think this is a basically infinite variety of any possible phonological object. And so the observation here is that, as far as we can tell, the vocal tracts and the ears of humans across the species are uniform. So every child is born in some sense with the same ability to hear whatever sounds are involved in any language and to make whatever sounds are involved in any language. And sometime in the first, 2 to 10 years of their lives, they go from being having a general human capacity to learn any language to only knowing the grammar of the language they've been exposed to, right? So we know, again, that if you take any human infant and put them in any environment with any language being spoken, they will acquire that language, right? So all human infants seem to be born with the same general capacity to produce and perceive speech sounds and learn patterns in those speech sounds. And we model that, again, with this rich universal base, right? An infant who's being born with a linguistic capacity to learn a grammar doesn't know whether they're gonna end up speaking Maori or English or Russian, and so they better be prepared to acquire any sound pattern that's characteristic of any of these human languages. And so we model that again with this universal base, so anything can show up here. And from this perspective, the job, right, of an infant who's learning English or Maori or Russian or any other language is to get from this initial state of having a universal base that they can apply their hearing and their speech to the final state of having a grammar of English or a grammar of Maori or a grammar of Russian, right? So how are we going to do this? In this theory, the hypothesis is that, well, maybe we use constraints to filter this base down until it only allows possible English words or possible Maori words or possible Russian words to be pronounced. And we refer to those possible pronunciations as outputs, right? So what would this work like? Well, all the infants are potentially being exposed to all of these things. But if you're an infant that's learning one kind of a grammar, I'm going to draw the grammars here as sort of black boxes. Inside these are lots of constraints, and the exact form of that is what we're going to be working on for the rest of the semester. But let's imagine that this one is the English grammar that you eventually need to acquire, the Maori grammar that you eventually need to require, and just for the sake of comparison here, I'll make this one a Russian grammar that you need to acquire, right? And so the idea is that once a child acquires some of the constraints and gets them in the right order, they're going to go from being able to process and perceive any of these words to only allowing them to be pronounced if they meet the phonotactic demands or the grammatical demands of the language that they've acquired during their infancy. And so, for instance, eventually, we would expect Maori speakers to be able to map this one through no problem. And then we're going to end up with an observed language here that's going to involve things like papa, no problem. But these two will not be able to pass through because Maori grammar is going to contain some kind of a constraint that blocks words like this from being from existing. And in particular, there are no words in Maori that contain two consonants next to each other. So these are both unpronounceable in Maori. And so instead, these are going to come out in some other form. Exactly which form we'll get to during this lecture. But for the moment, let's just say that they don't have this, and they don't have this, and so on and so forth. Of course, if you're an English learning infant, then this can pass through okay. Here's the English output cloud. And we're going to have no problem with strings like papa. We're going to have no problem with strings like blop. Note that even though this isn't an existing English word, it's not problematic as a possible English word. If I told you that I saw a blop outside, you might think that it's some weird word that I learned on the internet or something like that, but you're not going to say, oh, that can't possibly be an English word. But something like kto, which is actually Russian for who, this one can't pass through English grammar. And in general, we don't have any words that begin with two stops in a row in English. So this is going to be different from this. And then I put Russian up here because in Russian, theoretically, any one of these is going to be a possible word. And so the Russian grammar we get down at the bottom here. Am I off the camera yet? Not quite. This one's going to accept all of these possibilities. Sorry, this is a little bit hard to read. I'm just writing these inputs as outputs, and in Russian, any one of them is going to be acceptable. And so the basic idea here is that we're taking as a given that all children are born with the same ability to learn any grammar. We model that using this rich base. We know that in the end, they're going to wind up with languages that have different patterns of grammatical acceptability for different kinds of words. And so our job as phonologists, and in some sense the infant's job as a language learner, is to figure out what's happening in these black boxes that are phonological grammar that allows languages like English, Maori, and Russian to all get learned and take this final output form on the basis of this universal rich base. So in some sense, this is a much more ambitious kind of theory than you might think when you start looking at distributions in a language and you think, well, our job as linguists is to describe how sounds are distributed in a language. And yes, that's part of our job, but this theory takes a much more ambitious goal, and it's looking for a computational level theory of what grammars are like, such that the same infant, when exposed to different patterns of input and potentially an infinite variety of inputs, can end up having different grammatical output patterns, different phonologies, depending on what is being spoken in the environment around them. Right? So this is sort of recasting our generative model as a model of language acquisition. The idea being we better be able to come up with a theory where all children start out the same, and the things that they learn, right, the things that make English English and Maori Maori and Russian Russian, are going to have to be adjusted right, in order to produce the right output grammars. Now, we're not going to study this semester the process of exactly how that adjustment happens. What we're going to be studying is what the theories of grammar inside these boxes would need to look like in order to take any potential input and map them only onto acceptable outputs within each one of these languages. Right? That's the basic idea here. And so some of the constraints we've seen, some of the filters that exist inside each of these grammatical black boxes are the markedness constraints that we've been looking at in this class. And we've distinguished several kinds of constraints that deal with several kinds of phonological distributions. And these phonological distributions are going to be super important for the rest of this semester and next semester if you're taking the advanced class. So let me briefly review these. And I'm going to get rid of this picture and make a little chart of the kinds of distributions that we've been looking at. And these are really distributions of features rather than distributions of sounds per se. They're distributions of natural classes of sounds, where that might be a single sound or it might be a whole bunch of different sounds that all share a feature. And these are going to vary more or less along 2 dimensions. This is a bit of a simplification, but it's going to be good enough for this semester. So we can have distributions of features where they're contrastive in at least one place. There's at least one position in the language where the feature can minimally distinguish lexical items versus non-contrastive, where the feature is never contrastive in a language. And then we also have this axis where they can either be context-free, that is, features don't change on the basis of phonological context, versus context-sensitive, where they do change on the basis of phonological context. And note this contrastive versus non-contrastive property can also be restated as phonological predictability. Right? So a feature that's contrastive, that can minimally distinguish lexical items, is going to be phonologically unpredictable because it can take on either feature in the context where it's contrastive. That's what a minimal pair is. Right? Features that are non-contrastive in some particular environment are going to be phonologically predictable because if it can only take on one value, if it's not contrastive in some context, then the phonology, if you give me the phonological context, I'll be able to tell you what the value of the feature is. So sometimes I'm going to refer to these as unpredictable and predictable. They mean basically the same thing. So one of the kinds we looked at, kinds of distributions here, was just inventory constraints. And these are constraints on which features are allowed to occur in a language or which features can generally distinguish lexical items from one another. So where do you think those would fall in this chart? Well, inventory constraints, things like English doesn't have adjectives or implosives, these are going to fall under the situation where they're not contrastive, right? That's exactly what it means when we say that English doesn't have adjectives. The constricted glottis feature is predictable in English. It's non-contrastive. It's always minus, right? And these inventory constraints are things that don't change by context. It's not that English has adjectives in some contexts but not in others. It doesn't have any adjectives anywhere. So these are going to be context-free and non-contrastive distributions or constraints. Things like star plus constricted glottis are going to be context-free constraints that hold everywhere, and in English that's going to be a fully non-contrastive feature. Right? In Maori we saw that there were no minimal contrasts for voicing, so plus or minus voice is going to fall under this rubric where there's going to be star plus voice minus sonorant, so no voiced obstruents, and star minus voice plus sonorant, so no voiceless sonorants. Those are both going to be inventory constraints in Maori. The obstruent one doesn't hold in English. It's not an inventory constraint. So the distributions of voicing are different in English and Maori. Another one we looked at are across the board sort of contrastive features. And these are features that are contrastive in a language almost everywhere. Now, there's a little bit of complexity there we're going to ignore for the moment. But the example I gave came from English voicing, where voiced and voiceless stops in English are contrastive in almost every position. And of course, there are some exceptions, but for the moment, this is going to be our example. Other examples here, English continuancy is contrastive for most obstruents. You have contrast between stops and fricatives at most places of articulation in English. Not every place, but most places. And backness for vowels, that seems to be contrastive in a variety of contexts in English. Similarly, Maori has pretty clear nasality contrasts for consonants, and they have backness contrasts for vowels, etc. And so the value of these features, these are going to be features that are contrastive just about everywhere. Where does that fall in here? Well, like I just said, they're contrastive features. They're unpredictable. They distinguish minimal pairs in a language. And the ones we're talking about here are ones that don't vary much by context, or at least that don't vary in the context we've been looking at so far. And so we're going to put these in the contrastive and context-free zone of this chart. Right? So I'll call this free contrast. And then the other two are sort of trickier ones. These are the ones that do vary by context. And one of these we looked at was positional neutralization. And this is a case where a feature can minimally distinguish morpheme meanings in some position, but not in other positions. And so we saw examples of this in English, where the tense lax feature is generally contrastive for many vowels, but not at the end of a monosyllabic word. Right? So we can have words like may, but not words like meh. Of course, meh is an interjection, but we don't think that follows the phonotactic constraints of English. And the point here is that these are features that are contrastive somewhere, and that's why I said that this contrastive means contrastive in at least one place. Right? But in other contexts, they become non-contrastive. So word finally in English, the value of a vowel for tense lax is predictably plus tense, even though elsewhere it's contrastive. And so we're going to put that in this square. Positional neutralization, also called contextual neutralization. Same thing. Oh, right out of the room. Yeah, and so that's going to fill in this third square in this chart. And the last square here is going to be a feature or a distribution of features that's non-contrastive, that's fully predictable, but that varies by context. And we looked at that in the last session as well. Oh, I should say one more example for Maori of positional neutralization. We saw that in the general case, labial consonants can contrast for continuancy. So there are both fricatives and glides as well as stops at the labial place of articulation in Maori. And they're contrastive. They can minimally distinguish word meanings, but not before or around vowels. So in that context, the contrast neutralizes, and it has to be minus continuant, so it's phonologically predictable in just that context, but not in the other one. Another case of positional neutralization. The last possibility here was complementary distribution, where you have fully predictable feature values, but they vary by different contexts. And so in this kind of a distribution, which is also referred to as allophonic or allophony, you get a feature whose value is predictable, but one value of the feature occurs in one set of positions, and the other value only occurs in the complementary set of positions, that is, the other positions elsewhere in the language. And so examples we saw here was English nasality for vowels, where in general English doesn't have any vowels that contrast for nasality, but vowels are predictably nasal before a nasal consonant, and they're predictably oral elsewhere in every other context. The value of these features are predictable and non-contrastive, but they vary by context. And so these distributions are said to be complementary, and this is complementary. It's the mathematical complement is everything except the thing you're talking about, not a compliment. That's when you tell somebody that they look nice or something like that. So these are complementary distributions or allophonic distributions. Allophonic rules, allophonic variation, allophony. This goes under a lot of different related names in phonology. It's more important that you know the formal properties of the distribution than all the different names that it's called. But those all basically mean the same things. Yeah, and so we were looking last time at how to model each of these distributions with a series of markedness constraints. We're getting there, we're not quite there yet. And so you can see this as fitting into this overall project, right, of trying to figure out what the grammars that kids eventually acquire look like in order to produce outputs that look like English or Maori or Russian. We know that one of the things that differs between these languages is the distribution of different features. And so if we can get some constraints that enforce different distributions of features, then we'll be part of the way towards figuring out what children would need to infer in order to learn the grammar of their language, which is one of the ultimate points of linguistic theory, right? So here's some of the things we looked at. Markedness constraints that we've been using so far just declare that certain combinations of features or sequences of combinations of features don't surface in a given language. That's what we've been looking at so far. So we found things like star plus implosive in English, and that's just encoding the fact that English doesn't allow any implosive consonants whatsoever. And so that's going to go in this box of inventory constraints. In other languages that do have implosives, obviously that distribution is going to be different. And so we're going to need to change our assumptions about constraints there. In Maori, we saw a context-sensitive constraint. Don't have a labial continuant followed by a round vowel. Star plus labial plus continuant followed by plus round. That's going to be a context-sensitive kind of constraint. In particular, in Maori, it's going to be a positional neutralization kind of constraint. That could be different in some other language. And unlike our rule formulations, so we've also been looking at various ways of stating these restrictions as rules. These constraints don't say what happens to sequences that violate them, except that they're not allowed to be pronounced or that they're not allowed to pass through as outputs in the grammar. So we are part of the way towards having a theory of cross-linguistic variation in distributions, but there's a few missing pieces here. We also saw that trying to find evidence about what really happens in such cases can be pretty hard, right? But this is going to be important, right, because we want to model not only what kinds of things are not allowed to be in the output of a language, but also what happens to things that come in as an input that can't be pronounced as output. Where do they go? I'm going to refer to this as mapping, the mapping problem. How do we map inputs to outputs? Sometimes also referred to as repair strategies. What does your grammar do to sound sequences that are broken in terms of your grammar? How does it repair them? Right? So for sequence of sounds that are not allowed to occur after one another, we could try putting morphemes together in order to get the sounds in question next to each other and then see what happens. This is referred to as a phonological alternation or a morphological alternation or a morphophonological alternation. And we're going to study this extensively in a few weeks. But for sounds that just aren't allowed in the language at all, that's not going to work. Now we talked about a couple ideas for how we might get evidence about what happens to unattested sounds that come into the input of a language. The one we're going to focus on here is a very common phenomenon that lets us really clearly see what happens with both illegal sounds and illegal combinations of sounds, and it is loanword adaptation. So one of the things that phonological theory can do is it can help us explain why when words enter a language from some other foreign language, they undergo the changes that they do and don't undergo some other pattern of output realizations. And this is particularly easy to see in loanword adaptation because we know exactly what the input was like. We can study it in the other language that the words came from. So we'll talk about this in Maori in just a moment.